there, I chose to do a think aloud for the last section of the politics of access and the politics of representation, starting on page 15. So here we go. In Chapter 4, Representing Remediation, the Politics of Agency, 1985 to 2000, I link the representation of remediation to efforts to stratify the four-year sector, both nationally and in New York. I noticed that stratify, well, now she's saying re-stratify. And when I took notes earlier, I noticed she was using the term stratify. So that seems to be an important concept, and I'm wondering what it means specifically here. Let me read it again. I link the representation of remediation to efforts to re-stratify the four-year sector both nationally and in New York. I'm not sure based on that particular sentence. Reimagine, to stratify. Yeah, that one stumps me, even though I feel like it's important. I'm going to keep going because I wonder what it means here. Since, as Clark had suggested in his case study research, stratification can't proceed without the consent of groups with opposing interests, the representation of remediation becomes ideological when it serves to build class coalitions. This is interesting to me. I'm picturing different tiers based on what she says here and also what I've taken in my notes. The tiers of classes, tiers of groups of students, tiers of faculty. I wrote down in my notes that she uses the term politics a lot. In just the last section I read, the first 14 pages, she said politics of meaning, politics of remediation, politics of access, politics of representation, and politics of language. So when I read this part here about stratification, I'm picturing stratification in terms of tiers and hierarchies and different power dynamics, levels of importance. I'm going to keep going here. For instance, I focus on how a coalition of critics in New York City fomented, which I've never seen that word, a literacy crisis in order to create a class consensus. So maybe fabricating, making up a literacy crisis in order to create a class consensus to downsize public higher education. This is interesting to me because as a composition major and a person who has a degree in composition, I'm excited to see someone who's calling this out, this idea of a literacy crisis. Especially when I think of students, I'm imagining my students and some of the literacy ways of knowing that they have that are very valuable, the cultural knowledge, and then also how uncomfortable we feel often. I felt, and I know some of my students are feeling, most of my students are feeling about their literacy as it is defined through an academic lens. This also reminds me of what she said earlier about Mina Shaughnessy's research and how Mina was looking more at language and meaning and how she favored academic discourse. And so that's interesting to me. I'm wondering where she's going to go with this argument. In order to create a class consensus to downsize public higher education. Through the State University of New York and CUNY, were the focus of though the State University of New York and CUNY were the focus of a fierce debate that spanned a decade and culminated in a series of reforms for both systems, remedial students at the City University played a central ideological role in all these struggles. This kind of reminds me of what she said earlier, which I took a note of, the representations of remediation, which is one thing that she's looking at, and one thing that I am interested in looking at, how we represent remediation and its relationship to basic writings roles, and then how that connects with students' illiteracy. I've been around long enough to see the language change from remediation to basic skills, and so I'm wondering now how much of it is the language that we're using but we're really talking about the same thing. As these debates raged nationally in New York, remedial students in New York, as These debates rage nationally. In New York, remedial students emerged as members of a special urban underclass who were suddenly discovered by journalists like James Traub and others, use these students to assign agency to the culture deprivation they argued is typical of anti-intellectual inner-city minorities. I use the analysis of culture war developed by Barbara Ehrenreich, never pronounce her name, Ira Shore, and John Trimber to read several texts written by public intellectuals as well as composition scholars. This is neat to me because I read those people as a comp student, and so I feel like the argument that's being posed here by the author, whose name I forgot, is really expanding our way of understanding what we thought we knew back then, even when I was in grad school. So that's it for now because it's already 5 minutes.